If you're new to our channel, don't forget to hit the subscribe button.
The Ivy Organics 3-in-1 Plant Guard Hotline and bring in our next guest.
Todd Heft is the garden blogger of the Big Blog of Gardening, author of Homegrown Tomatoes, Step-by-Step Guide to Growing Delicious Organic Tomatoes in Your Garden, and fellow tomato lover. On his blog, he shares advice on caring for your flower gardens, vegetable gardens, and lawn using no synthetic fertilizers or pesticides. Welcome to the program, Todd.
Good morning. How you doing?
We're doing well. I understand that you're still digging out from several northeasterns up there, and hope everything's going well.
Yeah, we got hammered middle of the week, and it was just a mess here in Pennsylvania. I'm in the Lehigh Valley, which is kind of like right in between New York and Philadelphia, so we were right on the edge of that storm. It was brutal.
We've talked about we will be talking about bringing birds into our garden. Some people think that's a bad thing. How are birds beneficial to your garden?
Well, years ago, I'm a bit of an old timer, but years ago, when I grew up, when we started gardening, it was about chasing all the birds away, right? And now, since I've read a lot of very old school books on gardening and farming, I have discovered that birds are extremely beneficial because they eat the pests. They eat the pest insects. They're a delicacy to the birds. Of course, we don't want them in there. And so what I've done is I've set up a lot of bird feeders around my property, all over the place. And I'll tell you, it's made a huge difference.
And that's the thing. You entice them with the bird feed. You bring them in, they're going to eat those bugs. Now people will say, "Oh, they're poking holes in my tomatoes." Well, I contribute that to they need more. They're looking for water. So if that's the case, add a bird bath, and you're going to have the best ecosystem you've ever experienced in your backyard.
Yeah, and my attitude is, hey, I'm paying them for their services once in a while, right?
Absolutely.
It's okay. I mean, I'm growing 12 to 14 tomato plants every year. I mean, I'm taking in bushels. If I lose one or two to a friendly bird who's looking for a caterpillar, so be it.
Definitely. So as we approach the gardening season, for those who are new to gardening, or maybe it's their second year or something, what is one piece of advice you'd like to give new gardeners?
I think the biggest piece of advice I give to a new gardener or someone who hasn't done it before at all is don't be intimidated by it. I was actually in my dentist's chair one day many years ago, and the hygienist said to me, "Oh, I wanted to start a garden for so long, but I'm kind of scared to do it. I don't know what to do." And as you guys probably learn, all children or whenever you started gardening, it's like you just stick your hands in the dirt and go to town. There's no... One thing we learn in gardening is that you do fail, and there's no shame in that.
Right.
We learn from it.
Right, and if you don't fail, you either didn't try very hard or you're a liar. Right.
Yeah, I'd say the latter, probably.
Yeah.
No matter how hard you try, the weather can sometimes be your worst enemy, and I mean, it can take out your entire garden some years, unfortunately. Rarely, but it can happen.
And that's what I tell people. We're supposed to get a little warm snap here in the next couple of days, but then it's going to turn off cold again. I'd much rather plant my crops 2 weeks later than the second time with my neighbor when he plants it the first time.
Oh, yeah, but, the garden center loves when they plant early, right?
Oh, absolutely.
They get wiped out, and they have to go buy them again.
Yeah. So in gardening, we have a language all of itself. What are some of the more confusing terms us more seasoned gardeners use that may confuse new gardeners?
I think maybe, I don't know about terms, but maybe about concepts might be the best way for me to approach that question. I think one of the most difficult things for people to learn is that sometimes you should do less rather than do more. You should add less to your soil. You should pick fewer weeds than to worry about having a perfect soil and quote unquote a clean garden. Because I have found that sometimes my laziest years around the garden are my most productive years.
You kind of let nature take its course. The weak ones are going to die no matter what you do. Try to save them anyway. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the biggest mistakes new gardeners make is overwatering. I mean, overwatering can just take out your tomatoes and peppers very quickly.
Right, and you said you kind of you add less to the soil and kind of let things happen, but as we know, the soil is the lifeblood of the plants, and how do you build that soil up for that most successful crop, even if you don't have a lot of effort going into maintaining it?
I'm all about compost. I make my own compost, and basically in the beginning of the season, I add a couple inches of compost to the beds before I plant, just really early, like pretty soon I'll be doing that. And let it sit there until I put the plants in, and then I add a little bit more. And I do use a little bit of organic fertilizer to start the plants, just sort of build a base. After that, there's not a lot that needs to be done. I've taken some courses from Rodale here, which is a big organic, they're associated with the universities around here, and they do a lot of studies for the USDA. And their classes on organic gardening are unbelievable because you'd be surprised at how little they recommend you do. And you go see their gardens, and they're spectacular. And they're kind of all about making the compost correctly, laying it on there early in the season, and then just adding it once or twice more, and you are kind of done.
Well, let's talk about what is the right way to make compost, because everybody has these, I can only add X, Y, and Z materials. What do you recommend for the correct compost pile?
Yeah, that's a trick. And honestly, that was one of the most difficult things that I learned, and I experimented for years because, as you know, if you put in too much green stuff, it gets all stinky and the microbes build up too much. And if you have too much brown stuff in there, too much carbon-based stuff, nothing happens. Well, not nothing happens, but it's a very, very slow process. So some of it's experimentation because it also depends on where your compost bin is located on your property and how much sunlight it's getting, how much heat is building up in there. So I kind of, I put a lot of yard waste in there. I put my non-meat food scraps in there as well. And I observe the compost throughout the year and see how it's cooking down. And I make the adjustments appropriately. Now I've pretty much got my system in place. I know what to expect. I know how much of each to put in there. So it is a bit of an experimental process for a kind of science geek like me. It's a lot of fun. Other people may not like that, and they can buy tons of compost.
Definitely. So what is one of the biggest mistakes you would say you have ever made in gardening? You just learned largely from it.
Oh, boy. I was guilty of overwatering in the past, and I ended up creating a situation where a lot of fungi was introduced into the garden. And I basically, my tomato patch was just about taken out one year. That was very early on in the process. When you have a lot of rain coming down and then you're watering on top of that, it's just a disaster. Other mistakes I made was planting sun-loving crops in a place where later in the season they might be shaded out by trees, so you get kind of underproduction, and just the opposite too. An area that's shady in the beginning of the year isn't always shady near the end of the year, depending on how your property is oriented, how your garden is oriented regarding the sun. So, I learned to understand how the sun tracks across my property over the course of the year, and I plant the appropriate crops in the appropriate places now. That was one of the biggest mistakes I made.
How do you maintain soil fertility in containers throughout the growing season? A lot of people grow in containers, especially in urban areas. How do you maintain that soil fertility?
Well, the main thing is to basically create your planter correctly out of the gate. You have to use a very good potting soil, and you don't buy potting soils with chemical fertilizers in them. I'm strongly against that because it creates a salt buildup in the container, which doesn't do your plant any good. They start off great, and then they kind of become feeble later in the season. For instance, perfect example is my neighbor. I live in a city zone. I've got like a quarter-acre property, and I'm just like planted out all over the place. My neighbor was a container gardener for years. He grew his peppers and tomatoes in containers. And he, it's hard for me to say anything to him, but he overwaters, and he was feeding them with chemical fertilizers almost every time he watered. And after 2 months, notoriously every single year, his peppers started to droop. He was getting disease. He had very little foliage on them. He couldn't understand what was going on because he looked at my garden, and they were just exploding. So I gently coerced him over to my way of thinking, and now his crops are fantastic. So the containers, you cannot overfeed your plants in containers, and you should always buy a very good potting soil. You don't need compost in those containers. You just need a gentle organic feed. I always recommend a granular fertilizer. But you do have to feed them very differently than if you were growing them in soil.
Well, let's talk about your book, the Homegrown Tomatoes, the step-by-step guide to growing delicious organic tomatoes in your garden. What is something unexpected that people can learn from this without giving too much information away?
Well, there's two things. I actually learned while I was doing the research for the book. Early on in the book, I kind of get into the history of tomatoes and their origins. And the first thing I learned was why tomatoes are classified as a vegetable instead of a fruit. Botanically, tomatoes, since the seeds grow on the inside of the tomato, it's technically a fruit, yet it's classified as a vegetable. Well, I explain why in that book. I also explain where tomatoes originally came from, and if you think it's Italy, you're so wrong, it's unbelievable.
Well, how can people find your book, and how can people find more about you, Todd?
The book is available on Amazon, and you can get a link to that on my website, bigblogofgardening.com.
Well, Todd, we greatly appreciate you taking your time out of your day and sharing some of your garden wisdom with Holly, myself, and all of our listeners.
I appreciate the invitation. Anytime. I'll come back.
Absolutely. And
Thank you, Todd.
Thank you for checking out the Wisconsin Vegetable Gardener Radio Show. For more, go to the WisconsinVegetableGardener.com for full-length in-studio video and podcast replay of Season 1. Season 2 underway and added weekly. Tweet us at TWVG Show or hashtag TWVG to be part of the program.